November 14th, 1873, Judith Basin, Montana Territory. Temperature dropping through the 20s and still falling. Opal Sheridenter stood at the edge of her brother-in-law's claim, holding everything she owned in a flour sack, watching smoke curl from the chimney of what used to be her home. The cabin she had built with her own hands, the walls she had chinked while her husband Sheridan talked about trapping fortunes that never materialize. The furniture she had constructed from cottonwood and stubbornness, while Sheridan checked trap lines that would eventually kill him. Her sister Honora stood in the doorway but would not look at her. The accusation had been simple enough. $3 silver missing from the household tin, Barrett's word against hers. And Barrett Braddock, who had married Honora 2 years before the family crossed the Atlantic, and had spent every day since positioning himself as the reasonable one, the practical one, the man who held both claims together while the women kept house, had prepared his evidence with the patience of a man who plans things months in advance. He had slipped one of those silver dollars into the pocket of Opal's coat where it hung by the door, found it there in front of Honora with theatrical surprise, held it up between two fingers like a man displaying a dead mouse. $3, Opal. That is what family trust is worth to you. Opal had looked at the coin, looked at Barrett, looked at her sister, whose hands were trembling at her sides even as her face stayed carefully blank. Honora knew. Opal was certain of it. Honora knew her husband had planted that coin the same way she knew Barrett wanted both homestead claims consolidated under his name, the same way she knew Opal had worked that land for 18 months after Sheridan froze to death on a trap line in the winter of '72, the same way she knew that frontier law tilted toward men with inheritance rights and women with nothing tilted toward the ground. Honora knew all of this, and Honora had chosen. Opal tried one last thing. She spoke in Polish, the language only the two sisters shared, the language of their mother and their grandmother in the Carpathian foothills where they had learned to walk. Siostra, she said, sister, you know me. You know I never touched that money. Honora flinched, but when she answered in English. Barrett's language, the language of the side she had picked. You need to leave, Opal, before it gets dark. Not an accusation, not even a command, really. It was an apology disguised as an order, and Opal understood it perfectly. Honora was surviving the only way she knew how, by sacrificing the person she could afford to lose. Opal picked up her flour sack, turned her back on the cabin, walked away without looking behind her because she knew if she turned around she would beg, and she would rather freeze on the open prairie than beg anyone for anything ever again. The nearest settlement was Fort Benton, 67 miles north across open grassland. Everyone would assume that was where she headed. A woman alone in November with winter already painting the Highwood Mountains white. Where else would she go? Fort Benton had a church, had charity houses, had laundry work that paid 15 cents a day if you were lucky enough to get it, competing against 200 other desperate souls for the privilege of scrubbing strangers' clothes until your knuckles bled. Opal did not head for Fort Benton. She turned west, not because she feared the 67 miles of open prairie between here and there, although that fear was reasonable. Not because she doubted her ability to survive the walk, although at 29 years old and underweight from a year of ration meals, doubt would have been justified. She turned west because of something she had seen the previous spring. During a water haul from the creek, she had wandered farther than usual, following the drainage upstream, where it cut through a band of sandstone formations 3 miles west of the homestead. Cliff faces honeycombed with wind-carved alcoves, some shallow as a dog's bed, others cutting back 30 feet or more into the rock. She had stopped at one of the deeper ones, placed her palm flat against the stone wall, and felt something that took her brain a moment to process. The rock was cool. Not cold like the November air would be in 6 months. Cool, steady, the kind of temperature that did not care what the sky was doing. And in that moment, standing with her hand on Montana sandstone, Opal was 19 years old again, standing in a limestone cave in the Carpathian foothills of Poland, listening to her grandmother explain something that would save her life 10 years later on a different continent. Her grandmother, Babcia, was not a woman who wasted words. She was a shepherd in the high country above the village, a woman who had weathered more winters than she could count, by taking her flocks into the caves when the snow came and bringing them out alive in spring, while valley farmers dug corpses from collapsed roofs. The winter of 1862 had been the worst. Opal was 18, old enough to walk the mountain paths alone, old enough to help with the flock, old enough to understand what her grandmother was teaching and why it mattered. Snow fell for 19 days straight, collapsing barns and houses across the lowlands. Dozens died. But Babshia had walked her sheep into a cave mouth that barely fit two abreast, followed a passage back 40 feet into the mountain, and lived there with her flock for 7 weeks. Opal had joined her for the last 3 of those weeks, sleeping on limestone ledges, learning by doing what no book could teach. When the snow finally broke, Babshia had sat Opal on a ledge near the cave entrance, where weak spring sunlight filtered in, and spoken with the directness of someone who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance worth giving. Listen to me, child. 40 feet of rock above your head does not care if the wind blows 50 miles or 100. Earth holds its temperature when air goes wild. You remember this? The rock drinks heat slowly like an old woman drinking tea, and it gives heat back the same way, slowly, steadily, while wooden houses crack and lean and let the cold through every joint. Babcia had also taught her to build what she called a piece, the old Polish stove that had kept mountain families alive for centuries. You dug a fire pit 18 inches deep, lined it with flat stones, built a chimney from stacked rocks sealed with clay. The principle was gravity and patience. Hot air rose, pulling smoke with it, channeling exhaust along the ceiling and out through a gap near the entrance. Cool air from outside flowed in low to replace it, feeding the fire with fresh oxygen. The stones absorbed heat from the flames during burning, then released that heat slowly for hours after the fire died. A single evening burn could keep the stones warm until morning. And there was one more thing Babcia had pressed into her memory: frostbite. When a shepherd's hands or feet went white and waxy from cold, you never warmed them fast, never held them to the fire. You wrapped them in cloth soaked with cool water, and you raised the temperature gradually over hours, letting the frozen tissue thaw slowly enough that the cells did not rupture and die. Fast warming felt merciful. Slow warming was merciful. There was a difference, Babcia said, between what felt right and what was right, and a wise person learned to tell them apart. Opal carried all of this across the Atlantic when her family fled Poland after the failed uprising of '63. Her father, a blacksmith who had made pikeheads for the rebels, was a wanted man. They crossed into Austria, boarded a ship in Hamburg, arrived in New York in 1864 with new names and old knowledge. Kowalski became Hollister. Catholic became quietly Catholic. Polish became English slowly, painfully, with an accent Opal never fully lost. The last time Opal saw Babcia was on the dock in Hamburg. The old woman was too old and too attached to her mountains to cross an ocean. She stood on the pier as the ship pulled away, did not wave, just nodded once slowly as if to say, "I have taught you everything I know. Go." The years between Hamburg and Montana had not been kind. New York was noise and filth in a language that felt like chewing gravel. Opal's father found work in a foundry in Lower Manhattan, shaping iron instead of pikeheads, his rebel hands now serving the same industrial machinery he had fought against in principle, if not in practice. Her mother took in washing. Opal worked alongside her, learning English from the women whose clothes she scrubbed, picking up the language the way she picked up everything else through repetition and necessity, and the stubborn refusal to remain ignorant of anything that might prove useful. She married Sheridan Terre in 1869 at 25, not from love, but from the particular arithmetic that governed women's lives on the eastern seaboard. A woman alone was a target. A woman married was a citizen. Sheridan was charming and ambitious and convinced that the Montana territories held fortunes in fur and land for anyone bold enough to claim them. He painted pictures of open sky and endless prairie and a homestead where they would build something from nothing. Opal, who had already built things from nothing in 2 countries, recognized the dreamer in him, but married him anyway because the alternative was the Foundry District forever. And she had promised Babsia, silently standing on that Hamburg dock, that she would find her own mountain. Montana was not a mountain. It was a flatness that made the sky feel too large and the earth feel too exposed. But the land had bones, and Opal could feel them. Sandstone ridges running east to west, creek beds cutting through clay and gravel. And 3 miles west of the homestead, Sheridan claimed in the spring of 71, a band of cliff faces that reminded her of something she had not thought about in years. She reached those sandstone formations by dusk on November 14th, 1873, the day everything ended and everything began. The last light of the day turned the cliff faces amber and threw long shadows across the alcoves. She moved systematically, checking each opening, measuring depth with her steps, testing ceiling, height with her raised hand. Most were too shallow. Wind would cut through them like they were not there. A few were deeper, but angled wrong, open to the north, where winter wind would funnel straight in like water through a pipe. The one she chose was near the western end of the formation, 12 feet wide at the mouth, 22 feet deep, ceiling dropping from 7 feet at the entrance to barely 5 at the back. The floor sloped gently upward toward the rear wall, which suited her perfectly. Heat climbed, cold settled. She would sleep at the high end where the warmest air collected. That first night, she pressed herself against the back wall, wrapped in both dresses. She owned knees drawn to her chest, listening to coyotes work the draws below the formation. The stone against her back was not warm, but it was not the killing cold of the open air either. She could feel the steadiness of it, the massive thermal inertia of 100 million years of compressed sand. Outside, the temperature dropped to 19 degrees. Inside, at the back of her alcove, it held at 47. No wind penetrated past the first 6 feet of the entrance. The air was still, heavy, almost peaceful. Opal did not cry that night. Not because she was strong, although she was, because crying required energy she could not spare, and because tears would freeze on her face and waste body heat and moisture she might need tomorrow. But in the morning, when she woke stiff and cold but alive, she realized something unexpected. She had slept better than any night since Sheridan died. Not because of comfort, because for the first time in 18 months, no one could take this place from her. No brother-in-law with forged evidence, no sister choosing survival over blood, no frontier law tilting the ground beneath her feet. This cave belonged to no one, which meant it could belong to her. She made her decision before the sun cleared the Highwood Peaks. She was not running to Fort Benton. She was not sleeping in charity houses. She was not competing with 200 desperate souls for laundry work. She was staying here, and she was building. The next 4 days were a study in controlled desperation. Opal had learned rough carpentry on the homestead not by choice, but by necessity. Sheridan Terror had been useless with tools, all talk, no calluses. So Opal had built their cabin walls, hung their door, constructed their table and chairs, and sleeping platform, while Sheridan checked trap lines and dreamed of fortunes that existed only in his imagination. Now she applied those skills to scavenging. Cottonwood deadfall from the creek bottom, 3 miles downhill. Each piece carried back uphill on her shoulders, sometimes 2 trips a day, arriving at the cave entrance with legs shaking and lungs burning. She found an abandoned survey shack from the Northern Pacific Railroad expedition of 71, a collapsing structure half buried in sage. Pulled 10 usable boards from its walls, working fast, listening to the nails scream as they separated from rotting timber. On the 8th board, the entire structure groaned, shifted, and pancaked into the brush. She jumped clear with 2 seconds to spare and went back for the last 2 boards once the dust settled. From the wreckage, she also salvaged 6 feet of rusted chain, 3 bent nails she could straighten, and a cracked shovel blade that would serve as a scraping tool. Not much, but Opal had learned from Babsha that survival was not about having the right tools. It was about using the wrong tools correctly. On the 5th day, she saw a freight hauler passing on the Carroll Trail a mile south of the formations. She intercepted him at the trail crossing, held out her wedding ring, The last physical connection to her marriage to Sheridan, to the life that had ended with a frozen body on a trap line. The freighter was a weathered man with kind eyes and poor teeth. He examined the ring, recognized gold, and offered her a handsaw missing 7 teeth, a hammer, with half its handle broken off and a tarpaulin so riddled with holes it looked like something moths had used for target practice. "That ring could buy you passage to Helena, ma'am," he said, genuinely concerned. "Winter's coming hard. You don't want to be out here when it hits." Opal held the ring in her palm for a long moment before placing it in his hand. Sheridan had not been a good husband. He had been a dreamer, married to a builder, a talker, married to a worker. But the ring was the last thread connecting her to who she had been before this cliff, this cave, this new life she was constructing from salvage and memory. Letting it go was not easy. But she needed the saw more than she needed the memory. "Helena means starting over with nothing," she told the freighter. "Charity houses, laundry work. 15 cents a day if I'm lucky. This cave is not charity. Cave is..." The freighter shook his head and drove on. Opal watched him disappear into the grassland, then turned back to her cave with tools in hand. By November 28th, she had constructed a front wall for the cave entrance. Vertical cottonwood poles set 18 inches apart, gaps chinked with clay, from the creek bank mixed with dried grass for binding. The whole structure braced by horizontal stringers lashed with strips she cut from Sheridan's old leather belt. She left a doorway on the south side, 3 feet wide, covered with a tarpaulin weighted down by rocks along its bottom edge. 8 feet inside the first wall, she built a second wall, identical construction. Between the two walls, dead air, a gap that would trap heat the way a second pane of glass traps light. The principle was insulation through stillness. Moving air carried heat away. Still air held it close. The rear section behind the second wall she reserved for storage and sleeping. The front section between the two walls became her living and working space. And at the cave's mouth in front of the outer wall, she built a thing that would make everything else possible. She dug a fire pit following Babcia's design exactly as she remembered it. 18 inches deep, flat stones from the creek bed, chimney angled along the ceiling to vent smoke through a gap at the top of the outer wall. She worked from memory and muscle, trusting the hands that had helped Babcia maintain the peace in the Carpathian cave a decade ago. Opal tested it on the first night, burned cottonwood until the stones glowed, then banked the fire and retreated to the rear chamber. At midnight, she placed her palm on the hearthstones, still warm. At dawn, still warm enough to take the edge off the morning chill. She allowed herself to smile, the first genuine smile in weeks. Through the first week of December, Opal established a routine. Mornings check snare lines along the creek, haul water, gather firewood. Midday walk to Utica, 12 miles east, for any work that paid in food. Evenings fire the pit, maintain the walls, improve the shelter. She hung the tarpaulin as a secondary ceiling in the rear chamber, creating a pocket of trapped air above her sleeping area that raised the temperature another few degrees. She insulated the gap between her two walls with dried grass packed tight, working it into the spaces with her fingers until her hands cracked and bled from the cold and the clay. She fashioned a door latch from the bent nails and a strip of chain, because a door that could be closed was a door that meant something, and meaning mattered when you were building a life from nothing for the third time. Utica was not welcoming. Verity Prescott, wife of the general store owner, refused to sell to Opal directly. Verity was 40, sharp-tongued and protective of her community's reputation in the way that people who feel insecure about their own position often are. She stood behind the counter with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "I will not sell to a woman living like a wild animal in a hole in the ground. You are an embarrassment to every decent family in this basin. And if the Blackfeet find you in those caves, they will not distinguish between you and a trespasser. The trouble will come back to us." Opal did not argue. She found work instead, mucking stables for a rancher who paid in flour, hauling water for the livery, which paid in salt pork. Jobs no one else wanted performed without complaint, exchanging labor for calories, while Verity Prescott watched from behind her store window with tight lips and disapproving eyes. Ansel Aldrich found Opal at the livery one afternoon in early December. Ansel was 52, built like a barrel, homesteaded in the basin since '68. He had survived 2 winters that killed lesser men and buried enough neighbors to fill a small cemetery. Everyone called him Big Ansel, not because they needed to distinguish him from a smaller Ansel, but because the man himself seemed to require extra words just to account for his presence. He sat on a bench in front of the mercantile repairing harnesses with hands that moved through leather with practiced efficiency, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "You are living in a hole in the ground with winter coming on, ma'am. I have seen what happens when folks get creative about shelter out here. Found the Peterson family in March of '71, all 4 of them frozen solid in their dugout when the ventilation plugged with snow." He paused, threaded a needle through a leather strap without looking. "Rock does not burn like wood, but it does not breathe either. You get sealed in there with a fire going, the smoke will finish you before the cold gets the chance." Opal listened, nodded, said nothing. Ansel watched her walk away toward the western formations and muttered to the blacksmith working beside him, "She will die in that hole, but at least she is dying on her own terms. Respect that." Father Augustin Rollin arrived at the cave in the second week of December, riding a gray mare that picked its way through the frozen sage with obvious reluctance. He was 45, earnest, and convinced that God's plan for women did not include solitary cave dwelling and on the Montana frontier. "My child, this is not shelter. This is desperation. A woman alone in a cave 3 miles from the nearest Christian soul." He shook his head at the tarpaulin door, the rough walls, the fire pit that still smelled of last night's smoke. "I have buried 17 people in this territory since August. Most of them had better shelter than this. There is no shame in accepting help from the church." Opal thanked him politely, offered him coffee heated on hearthstones, continued working on a storage shelf while he finished his lecture and rode back to Utica. And then December provided its own answer to every skeptic. Temperature dropped below 0 on the 8th and stayed there for 6 days straight. The creek froze. The sage turned brittle as glass. Breath crystallized before it could rise. In Utica, families huddled around stoves that consumed firewood at alarming rates and still could not keep cabin temperatures above freezing in the corners farthest from the flame. In the cave, Opal woke each morning at the rear wall where the air held steady at 51 degrees. Walked forward to the fire pit where residual heat from the previous night's stones kept the front chamber at 44. Stepped outside into air so cold it turned breath to ice crystals before they could drift upward. Every morning the same. No wild swings, no frozen water buckets, no fighting constant shivers that drained energy and clouded thinking. She scraped frost from the underside of the tarpaulin ceiling each morning, condensation from her breathing that had frozen overnight and melted it for washing water. Waste nothing. Babshia's voice in a different language, a different century, but the principle crossed oceans just fine. What December confirmed food threatened to undo. Opal ran the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. 3 rabbits from her snare lanes in 2 weeks, maybe 600 calories total. Flour and salt pork from her Utica labor would last through January if she rationed with discipline, maybe into early February if she stretched it further. A woman her size needed 2,000 calories minimum per day to maintain body weight through winter. The mathematics were unfriendly. One night in mid-December, sitting by the cooling hearthstones, Opal counted her provisions for the 3rd time. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from something she had not allowed herself to feel since the day Honora told her to leave. Fear, real fear, the kind that settles in the stomach and whispers reasonable things. Maybe Ansel was right. Maybe this cave was just a more dignified way to die. Maybe she should have done the freighter's advice and used the ring for passage to Helena. She sat with that fear for 5 minutes. Let it fill the cave like smoke. Then she stood up, walked to the creek in the dark, adjusted her snare positions, and walked back. Not because the fear was gone, because sitting with fear and doing nothing was worse than walking through it. But the numbers remain. By February, if nothing changed, the cave would hold steady temperature around a body that no longer produced enough heat to matter. She needed more than intelligence. She needed luck. Or she needed someone. On December 19th, someone knocked on her tarpaulin door. Hjalmar Holmberg was 34, Swedish, broad-shouldered, and carrying a burlap sack of potatoes and dried beef. He had filed a homestead claim 4 miles south of the formations and built a cabin using railroad ties, pitched the roof steep to shed snow, installed a sheet metal stove he had purchased in Helena for $17. He was proud of that cabin, proud of the stove, proud of the way a man from Uppsala could master the Montana frontier through strength and preparation. He was also carrying a lecture about proper Christian living and the inadvisability of women dwelling alone in caves. Opal accepted the potatoes and the beef, ignored the lecture, fed him coffee from hearthstones, sent him home before dark. 2 days later, Hjalmar was back, but not with charity, with a request. His cabin had proved less waterproof than advertised. He had chinked the wall gaps with clay that cracked when it dried, and the first heavy snow had melted on his hot roof, run down to the eaves, refrozen into ice dams that channeled meltwater straight through his walls. Everything inside was damp. He had spent 3 nights trying to sleep in wet blankets, while his expensive stove consumed soggy firewood that produced more smoke than warmth. He stood at her cave entrance, soaked, shivering, hat in hands, asking for a place to sleep. Opal looked at him. This man who 2 days ago had offered her charity and scripture, who had stood in this exact spot and suggested kindly but firmly that a woman should not live this way, who had a $17 stove and a cabin built from railroad ties and confidence. Now he was asking to sleep in her cave. She stepped aside. Left corner. Do not touch the hearthstones. In the morning you work. Hjalmar Holmberg walked in, lay down on the stone floor of the front chamber, wrapped in his damp coat, and slept. Dry, warm, safe. In the morning he woke before Opal finished her routine, and he watched her scrape frost from the tarpaulin ceiling and melt it for water, watched her check the hearthstones with the back of her hand, testing residual heat like a baker testing an oven. Watched her step outside, check the snare lines, return with empty hands and no complaint. Watched her move through the cave with the efficiency of someone who understood every surface, every air current, every thermal principle at work in the space around her. Then he looked at the firewood stacked along the wall, perfectly dry, seasoned, because the cave held humidity at a constant 40%, low enough to cure wood, but high enough to prevent cracking. He thought about his own firewood sitting in puddles on his cabin floor, too wet to burn cleanly. He looked at the food stores organized on shelves Opal had built from salvaged lumber. He looked at the double wall system and the air gap between them. He looked at the hearthstone still warm from last night's fire, still radiating heat 12 hours after the last flame, and something shifted behind his eyes. The slow recognition of a man realizing he had fundamentally misjudged a situation. He had come here thinking Opal was surviving despite the cave. Now he understood she was surviving because of it. And the woman who had built all of this from salvage and memory and an old Polish grandmother's teachings was not desperate. She was competent, more competent than he was with his railroad ties and his $17 stove and his wet blankets. Hjalmar Holmberg did not leave that day. He did not leave the next day either. On the second morning, he asked Opal if he could reinforce the door frame. On the third morning, he split firewood without being asked. On the fourth morning, he started referring to the space as our cave, in a way that suggested he had already forgotten whose it was. And Opal, listening to that word from the rear chamber, where she was mending a snare line, felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. She had heard that word before. Our land, Sheridan used to say about the claims she maintained while he dreamed. Our home, Barrett had said about the cabin she had built with her own hands before he manufactured evidence to steal it from her. History had a pattern, and the pattern was men arriving with good intentions and leaving with everything. But that was a fight for tomorrow. Tonight the hearthstones were warm, the wind was outside where it belonged, and for the first time since November 14th, Opal Sheridan was not alone in the dark. Whether that was a blessing or a warning, she had not yet decided. On the seventh morning, Hjalmar Holmberg moved Opal's food stores to the opposite wall without asking. He had good reasons. The new position was closer to the cooking area, easier to reach during meal preparation, more logical by any measure of efficiency. He had already reorganized the firewood stack, rebuilt the storage shelf at a better height, and was halfway through rearranging the tool cache when Opal walked in from checking her snare lines, saw what he had done, and stopped in the middle of the cave. She stood there for a long time, long enough that Hjalmar noticed the silence and turned around with a piece of dried beef in one hand and an apologetic smile forming on his face. Opal spoke before the smile could finish. Hjalmar. Her voice was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that people who have been pushed past their limit learn to manufacture because the alternative is screaming. You built the door. I am grateful. You split firewood better than I can. I am grateful, but this is my cave. I found it. I built the walls. I dug the fire pit. I slept here alone when everyone in Utica said I would die. You want to stay, you ask me. You want to change something, you ask me. Are we clear on this, or do you want to go back to sleeping in wet blankets? Hjalmar opened his mouth, closed it, set the dried beef back on the shelf in Opal's original position, nodded once. We are clear. He never moved anything again without asking first. And Opal, watching him accept the boundary without argument or resentment, felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. Sheridan had pouted when corrected. Barrett had retaliated. Hjalmar simply adjusted. It was such a small thing. But on the frontier, small things were the difference between partnerships that survived and partnerships that became another story people told at the Mercantile about folks who should have known better. They settled into a rhythm through the rest of December. Hjalmar brought lumber from Utica, real millboards, purchased with credit from his homestead claim. Not salvaged cottonwood, proper planking. He built a sleeping platform in the rear chamber that kept them 8 inches off the cold stone floor. Hung canvas to divide the sleeping area into 2 separate sections because propriety mattered even in caves. Maybe especially in caves where the absence of walls made the presence of boundaries more important. A table and 2 chairs from lumber scraps. A proper storage system for their combined provisions. Opal watched the cave transform. Watched it stop being a shelter and start being a home. And she kept careful count of what was hers and what was his. Not out of selfishness, but because a woman who had lost everything twice understood that the line between generosity and ownership was thinner than canvas. In the second week of January 1874, Big Ansel Aldridge came to the cave. Not to lecture, not to warn, to see. He stood in the front chamber with his buffalo coat dusted in snow and his hands pushed deep into his pockets, and he looked at everything with the slow, careful attention of a man who had survived long enough to know that being wrong about something was not the same as being stupid about it. He touched the hearthstones, still warm from last night's burn. He looked at the double wall and the air gap between. He looked at the ceiling, dry and clean. No condensation dripping, no ice forming. He looked at the firewood stacked and seasoned. Then he turned to Opal. How did you build this fire system? Opal told him, briefly, her grandmother's method. Polished mountains. He did not need the physics. He needed the result, and the result was in front of him. Ansel was quiet for a while. Then, I have been in Montana 6 years, buried 23 people. Most of them died because they thought they knew better than this land. You are the first person I have met who seems to listen to what the land is telling her. Coming from Ansel Aldridge, this was not a compliment. It was a concession, the kind a proud man makes when the evidence against his position becomes too heavy to carry. Opal accepted it the same way she accepted the cold, without ceremony, because what mattered was not who was right about the cave, but that the cave worked. Ansel left that afternoon, but something had changed in the way he walked back toward Utica. Slower, thoughtful, as if he were recalculating something he had considered settled. The shift in Ansel's opinion might have been the most significant event of early January, but it was not the most dangerous. Samuel Cartwright arrived in the Judith Basin during the first week of January, riding a government mule with territorial survey maps rolled in a leather tube behind his saddle. Cartwright was 50, thin-lipped, meticulous, and employed by the Federal Land Office in Fort Benton. His job was to verify homestead claims, inspect boundary markers, and ensure that territorial land remained unoccupied by unauthorized structures. Someone in Utica had mentioned the woman living in the sandstone caves on public land. Cartwright came to investigate. He stood at Opal's entrance on a Tuesday morning, breath steaming, and examined her walls with the detached interest of an accountant reviewing a ledger. He did not comment on the craftsmanship, did not ask about the heating system, did not inquire about her survival or her story. He simply noted the structure, measured its dimensions by eye, and delivered his assessment. "This is federal land, Mrs. Sheridan. You have no claim, no filing, no legal right to construct permanent structures here. I can overlook a temporary camp, a week, perhaps two, but if I return in spring and find you still here, I will be obligated to file for removal." Opal met his eyes. "File for removal to where you want to evict me onto the open prairie in January." Cartwright straightened his collar against the wind. "The law does not concern itself with seasons, ma'am." He rode away on his government mule, and the cave felt different after he left. Not colder, but less certain. Opal had fought weather and hunger and the slow mathematics of starvation. Those were enemies she understood. Cartwright represented something else, a system that could take her home not with accusations and planted coins like Barrett, but with paperwork and procedure. Clean, legal, irresistible. Yalmar found her that evening sitting at the table staring at the hearthstones without seeing them. "He will come back," Yalmar said. "I know." "What do we do?" Opal thought about this. 4 months until spring. If the cave only saved her, Cartwright would close it. But if the cave saved more than just her, if it became something the community needed and relied on, then closing it would cost Cartwright more than leaving it open. She did not share this calculation with Yalmar. Not yet. Some strategies work better when they look like accidents. By the middle of January, the cave had become an unofficial warming station. 3 families had asked to overnight in the front chamber during particularly brutal cold snaps. Opal and Yalmar developed a system. Visitors could use the front section, but they contributed firewood and could not stay more than 2 nights without working off their debt in labor. Frozen freighters stumbled in after dark, thawed their hands by the hearthstones, and pushed onto Fort Benton at dawn. Riders caught between settlements during ground blizzards that reduced visibility to arm's length waited out the worst in Opal's front chamber. Grateful for warmth they had been told did not exist in a cave. Big Ansel Aldridge started sending people, specifically, by name, by direction. "You get caught between here and Utica after dark, you head for the Hollister Cave. 3 miles west, sandstone formations. You cannot miss it. Warmest shelter between Fort Benton and Helena. And I will fight anyone who says different." Father Rowland stopped calling the cave desperation. He started calling it an innovative application of Old World principles to New World challenges, which was priest language for admitting error without actually saying the words. And Verity Fenimore's son got lost. It happened on a January night when ground drift turned the prairie into a white blank. The boy was 12, making a delivery to a ranch south of town, and he missed the return trail in the blowing snow. He wandered for an hour, maybe longer, calling out for landmarks that had vanished behind curtains of white before the sandstone formation stopped him, the way they would later stop a horse carrying an unconscious Swede. The boy found the cave entrance by accident, walking straight into the tarpaulin door, with the dumb luck of someone too young to understand how close he had come to dying. Inside, he found warmth. Found Opal, who was mending a snare line by firelight and did not startle when a snow-covered 12-year-old stumbled through her door, gasping and crying. She fed him broth heated on the hearthstones, wrapped him in a dry blanket, and sat with him until the shaking stopped. The boy talked while he warmed, the way frightened children talk when the fear is leaving fast and scattered and circling back to the same details. He had been sure he was walking north toward town. He had been wrong. He had heard wolves or thought he heard wolves and had started running and running. In a ground blizzard of bars was the one thing you should never do because it cost you direction and energy simultaneously and gave you nothing in return. Opal listened, did not lecture, did not say a single word about his mother's refusal to sell her goods. The boy fell asleep on the platform Yalmar had built, still wearing his coat, one boot half unlaced his face slack with the particular peace of someone who has stopped being afraid. Verity Prescott arrived the next morning on a borrowed horse face tight with the particular terror of a parent who has spent a night not knowing. She stood at the cave entrance and looked inside, looked at her son sleeping peacefully, looked at the hearthstones, looked at Opal. Verity did not say thank you, did not apologize, did not explain or justify or recant anything she had said behind her store counter. She collected her son, mounted the horse, and rode back to Utica. But the next time Opal walked into the general store, Verity Prescott filled her order without comment. Same prices as everyone else. No eye contact, no warmth, but no hostility either. The door that had been locked was now merely closed, and Opal understood that in a place like Utica, that difference was the most anyone could expect. January 28, 1874. 2 weeks of manageable cold. Daytime temperatures around 18 degrees, nights dropping to 5 below. Then the wind shifted north and the sky turned a particular shade of yellow-gray that Opal had seen once before. The winter of 72. The sky had looked exactly like this the morning Sheridan left to check his trap lines. He had kissed her forehead and told her he would be back by dark. She had watched him walk into that yellow-gray sky, and the next time she saw him, he was frozen solid in a snowdrift 2 miles from the cabin, one hand still reaching for the trap line he never found. Barometric pressure was dropping, temperature falling 5 degrees per hour, wind building from a whisper to a moan to a roar. Opal knew these signs the way a sailor knows the color of storm clouds. Not from books, from burial. By 3 in the afternoon, snow was moving horizontally. By 4, visibility had closed to 6 feet. By 5, the temperature had plunged to 11 below zero and showed no sign of stopping. Yalmar had been in Utica since morning buying supplies. He should have been back by noon. Opal stood at the cave entrance and calculated 12 miles to Utica. If Yalmar had left at noon, he was halfway home. If he left at 1, he was 8 miles out. If he had waited for the storm to pass, he was safe in town, and she was alone with her worry. But Yalmar Holmberg was not a man who waited. He was the kind who trusted his own strength, who believed he could push through weather that turned back lesser men. The kind who had built a cabin from railroad ties and confidence and ended up asking a woman in a cave for shelter. Brave and foolish were cousins on the Montana frontier, and Yalmar had blood from both sides. Opal built up the fire pit until the stones glowed orange, hung extra tarpaulins across the entrance to break the wind, set water to heat. Then she stood at the mouth of the cave and listened. Between gusts and the half-second pauses when the wind drew breath before screaming again, she strained for anything that sounded like hooves or human movement. She found him at 7 in the evening. Or more accurately, she found his horse. The animal had walked straight into the sandstone formation and stopped, unable to go forward, too exhausted to turn back. Standing with its head down and its sides heaving, covered in a crust of frozen snow that made it look like a statue of a horse rather than the living thing underneath. Yalmar was still in the saddle, unconscious, hands frozen to the reins, face coated in a mask of ice formed from his own breath. His coat was stiff, his legs hung limp. He looked like a man who had died sitting up and simply forgotten to fall. The temperature had dropped to 23 below zero. Wind chill was pushing 60 below. Opal got him down from the horse. 180 pounds of dead weight that wanted to stay in the saddle the way frozen things want to stay where they are. She pulled and he slid, and she caught him badly, going down on one knee under his weight, then dragging him the final 30 yards to the cave entrance by his coat collar, her boots slipping on frozen ground, her shoulders screaming, her breath coming in gasps that crystallized and vanished. She got the horse inside too. because leaving an animal to freeze to death was something she could not do, and also because that horse represented 3 months of wages and Yalmar would need it in spring. And because on the frontier you did not waste what you could save, even when saving it cost you everything you had left in your arms, in your back, and your legs. The cave that night held one unconscious Swedish homesteader, one exhausted Polish woman, one terrified horse in a fire pit working harder than it had ever worked before. Opal cut away Yalmar's boots with the cracked shovel blade she had salvaged from the survey shack. The leather had frozen stiff as iron, and the laces were welded shut with ice. His feet were white, waxy. She had seen this before in the Carpathian caves in Babcia's hands working over a shepherd who had stayed too long in a mountain pass. She knew what to do, and she knew what not to do. And the difference between the two was Yalmar walking in spring or Yalmar losing both feet. She wrapped his feet and hands in cloth soaked with cool water from the cave's supply. Raise the water temperature by degrees over the next 3 hours, adding warmer water in small amounts, never rushing, never giving in to the impulse to hold his feet near the hearthstones, where the warmth would feel merciful and do irreparable damage. She kept him wrapped in dry blankets, but positioned away from the fire's direct heat, fed warm broth down his throat when he regained consciousness around midnight, delirious and combative, pushing away the cup and the hands that held it, not understanding where he was or who was keeping him alive. "You are in the cave," Opal told him in the darkness, holding his wrists until he stopped fighting. "You are safe. Stop moving." He stopped. Whether from understanding or exhaustion, she could not tell. But he swallowed the broth when she held it to his lips again, and sometime before dawn, his shivering changed from the violent, uncontrolled shaking of severe hypothermia to the steady trembling of a body that was cold, but winning its argument with the cold. By morning, the storm had reached its peak, 41 degrees below zero, wind sustained at 45 miles per hour, gusts to 68, wind chill somewhere past 90 below, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Inside the cave, the front chamber held at 38 degrees, the rear chamber at 49. The horse had calmed enough to accept water. Yalmar could feel his fingers again, which meant the frostbite was first degree, painful but recoverable. His feet would take longer, but Opal could see color returning under the dead white, and she knew the slow warming had saved what fast warming would have destroyed. The storm lasted 3 days. Not 3 days of continuous snow, but 3 days of sustained Arctic air that turned the Judith Basin into a place where survival was no longer about comfort, but about mathematics. How many hours of firewood remained? How many calories in the food stores? How many degrees separated the inside of the cave from the killing air outside? In Utica, 7 people died. 2 from carbon monoxide poisoning when they sealed their cabins too tight and their stoves consumed the oxygen in the room. 3 from freezing when their fuel ran out and no one came to check on them. 2 from hypothermia when they tried to walk to a neighbor's house and got turned around in ground drift that erased every landmark between here and there. 7 families buried someone they loved because shelter failed when it mattered most. In Opal's cave, no one died. The woman who had been living like a wild animal in a hole in the ground had kept herself a half-frozen Swede and a horse alive through the worst storm the basin had seen in 3 years. Word traveled the way it always does in small communities. Not through newspapers or announcements, but through conversation at the mercantile, through remarks between neighbors, through the slow accumulation of a story told so many times it becomes fact. The cave works. The Hollister woman knows something. Ansel Aldridge says it is the warmest shelter in the territory. Ansel Aldridge does not say things like that unless he means them. Big Ansel came to the cave after the storm broke. He brought whiskey and sat with Yalmar in the front chamber while Opal worked on repairing a snare that had snapped in the cold. "I was wrong about Mrs. Sheridan, Ansel said to Yalmar loud enough that Opal could hear from the rear chamber. "I told her she would die in this hole. She did not die. You nearly died. And she saved you in the hole I said would kill her." Then he raised his voice slightly. "Mrs. Sheridan, What do you need from me? I owe you. Opal came to the entrance of the rear chamber. When Cartwright comes back in spring, I need someone standing beside me. Ansel did not hesitate. Done. He finished his whiskey and left. And Opal understood that she had just acquired something more valuable than lumber or food or even the cave itself. She had acquired a witness, a man whose word carried weight in the basin, who had changed his mind publicly and who would not change it back. The weeks after the storm were quiet in the way that follows violence. Hjalmar's feet healed slowly. He could walk by the second week of February, but with a limp that would come and go for the rest of his life worse in cold weather, a permanent reminder written in damaged nerve endings of the night he trusted his strength more than the sky. He lost 2 toes on his left foot, the smallest, and the one beside it. Not unusual for Montana winters. Men lost fingers and toes and ears and noses to cold the way farmers in other states lost them to machinery. The frontier extracted its toll in flesh, and you paid it or you left. What changed between Opal and Hjalmar during those weeks of recovery was not dramatic. There was no confession of feeling, no moment of revelation, no scene that would satisfy a novelist's sense of timing. What changed was simpler and harder to name. Hjalmar stopped trying to be useful and started trying to be present. He sat at the table Opal had built and watched her work and asked questions, not about the cave or the fire pit or the engineering, but about her, about Poland, about Babcia, about the ship from Hamburg and the foundry district in New York, and the years of building things for men who took credit for the building. Opal answered some questions and deflected others. She was not accustomed to being asked about herself. On the frontier, women were asked about meals and laundry and children. They were not asked about the shape of their thinking or the geography of their past. Hjalmar's curiosity was awkward, sometimes clumsy, phrased in the blunt Swedish manner that made even gentle questions sound like interrogations. But it was genuine. And genuineness, Opal was learning, was rarer than gold in a territory full of men panning for it. By mid-February, settlers were visiting the cave not because they were frozen or desperate, but because they were curious. They wanted to measure temperature differences, wanted to understand the heating system, wanted to see how a cave could outperform their cabins. Adrian Hathaway arrived in late February. Dutch, 37, an engineer working for the Montana Central Railway who had heard about the cave from a surveyor who had heard about it from a freighter who had spent a night there during the January storm. Adrian spent 2 hours examining the fire pit, the ventilation, the thermal properties of the sandstone. He sketched the layout in a leather notebook with the precision of a man trained in technical drawing. "This is brilliant," he told Opal. "Simple but brilliant." Opal shrugged. "Knowledge is not property. Use it if it helps." Adrian also brought information. Cartwright was planning his spring inspection, but Adrian had researched the legal question and found a precedent. If Opal could demonstrate that the cave served as a public benefit, an improvement to federal land that served the community, there were grounds to resist removal. "I will write the technical report," Adrian offered. "Document everything, temperature data, structural analysis, usage records. Give Cartwright paperwork he has to take seriously." Opal nodded. The strategy she had not shared with Hjalmar was becoming real. The cave was no longer her shelter. It was becoming the community's shelter, and that made it harder to close. Through February and into March, 4 families in the basin modified their own shelters using principles they had observed in Opal's cave. The Johnsons dug a root cellar and moved into it instead of their drafty cabin, gaining 12 degrees of temperature stability. The Chen family Chinese railroad workers, who had turned homesteaders, built a second interior wall in their existing cabin and cut their firewood consumption by 40%. Old Oscar Kestrel, a German stonemason, constructed a fire pit system based on what he had seen in Opal's cave and reported that his wife's rheumatism improved within a week from sleeping in steady warmth instead of wild temperature swings. Opal shared everything she knew with anyone who asked, and each person who applied her methods and succeeded became another argument against Cartwright's removal order. In late February, Hjalmar asked Opal to marry him. He was practical about it. "I have a claim in farming knowledge. You have engineering sense and toughness. Together, we have a better chance than either of us alone. Also, we have not killed each other in 3 months, which is more than most married couples can claim. Opal did not answer that night. She lay in the rear chamber after Yalmar had fallen asleep, staring at the stone ceiling that she had memorized over 4 months of living beneath it, and she weighed the decision the way she weighed everything, with mathematics and memory. Marriage meant legal access to Yalmar's homestead claim, meant resources supplies standing in the community, meant she was no longer the cave woman, but Hjalmar Holmberg's wife, with all the legitimacy that title carried on a frontier that still measured women by the men they belonged to. But marriage also meant dependence. Sheridan had taught her that lesson. Barrett had reinforced it. Both times she had trusted a man with her security, and both times the security had been pulled away like a tablecloth yanked from beneath the dishes. In the morning, she told Hjalmar yes, with one condition. The cave stays in my name. It is the Hollister cave, not the Holmberg cave, not our cave, mine. Hjalmar did not hesitate, did not argue, did not negotiate. He simply said, of course, as though any other answer would have been foolish. And in that moment, Opal felt something she had not felt since Babshia nodded on the Hamburg dock. The particular relief of being understood by someone who did not require explanation. They married on April 3rd, 1874. Father Rowland presided. 47 people attended, which was more than attended Sunday services most weeks. The community's wedding gift was lumber, enough to build a cabin on Hjalmar's homestead claim with modifications Opal design. Earthen banking 3 feet high against the north wall, a stone fire pit, double wall construction with a 6-inch air gap. The result looked like a cabin from the road and performed like a cave where it counted. Fuel consumption dropped 60% compared to standard construction. Opal kept the cave, used it for cold storage year-round because its steady 45 degrees kept root vegetables fresh for months. Used it as a storm shelter because even the improved cabin could not match solid rock when wind hit 70 miles per hour. Used it as a reminder that the best answers were usually the ones already built into the landscape, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Summer passed. Autumn arrived early, the aspens turning gold by mid-September. And then October brought the first whisper of what was coming. First, snow fell on October 29th. Not unusual for Montana, but the snow did not melt, it stayed, and more came behind it. By November 12th, the temperature dropped below zero and settled there with the permanence of something that intended to stay. This was not the winter of '73, which had been cold but manageable. This was something older, something the land had been saving. The old-timers in Utica felt it in their joints and their memories. This was going to be the winter they would talk about for the next 50 years. The winter that killed cattle by the thousands and broke homesteaders by the hundreds. The winter when every marginal structure failed, when adequate became inadequate, when good enough proved fatal. Opal and Hjalmar prepared their cabin as thoroughly as anyone could. Double walls, earth banking, stone fire pit, extra insulation packed into the roof cavity. Firewood enough for 4 months of heavy burning. Food for the same duration. Candles, lamp oil, everything the mercantile recommended. On January 17, 1875, the temperature in Utica reached 52 degrees below zero. Not wind chill, actual air temperature. The creek froze solid to the bottom, a thing Opal had not believed possible until she walked out and saw it. Cottonwood trees exploded from ice expansion in their trunks, the sound carrying across the frozen prairie like rifle shots in the pre-dawn darkness. Smoke from chimneys did not rise. It fell sinking toward the ground because the air above was colder than the smoke itself, an inversion that defied everything a person expected fire and heat to do. This was cold that operated outside the rules, cold that killed quickly and without the courtesy of warning. The cabin held 51 degrees inside while the outside touched 52 below. Not comfortable, but survivable. They burned firewood constantly, fed the fire pit every 3 hours, dressed in layers even indoors. Got through the 17th, the 18th, the 19th. On the 20th, temperature climbed to 35 below. tropical by comparison. They allowed themselves to relax, to believe the worst had passed. On January 22nd, the wind came. Not wind, something else. A sustained blast from the north that hit 61 miles per hour and held there for 16 hours without pausing to breathe. Wind at that speed does not flow around obstacles. It interrogates them, finds every gap, every imperfection, every joint that is not quite tight enough, and pushes through with the patience of water finding cracks in a dam. The double wall system failed first. Wind pressure forced air through the gaps between the chinked logs, and the dead airspace that had been trapping heat all winter became a channel that pulled warmth out of the cabin and fed it to the storm. The fire pit kept the temperature from collapsing completely, but by midnight the interior had dropped to 38 degrees and was falling 2 degrees every hour. Hjalmar was feeding the fire pit so fast they would exhaust their entire wood supply in a week. The door rattled in its frame with a violence that sounded personal, as though the wind had identified this specific door as the weak point and was concentrating its full attention on breaking through. At 2 in the morning, with the inside temperature at 29 degrees and the fire-consuming fuel at a rate that guaranteed nothing, Opal made the call. "We go to the cave, now, before we are too cold to make the walk." Hjalmar looked at the door, looked at the fire pit, looked at Opal. He did not argue. They dressed in every layer they owned, loaded what supplies they could carry in 2 minutes, opened the door into wind that hit them like a wall of frozen sand. The cave was 200 yards away. 200 yards, and the wind was 61 miles per hour, and the temperature was somewhere below 30, and visibility was 0. Not from snow, from ground drift. Frozen crystals ripped from the surface and hurled horizontal by wind strong enough to strip flesh from bone. They held hands, and they walked, counting steps because navigation by sight was a fantasy, and navigation by faith was all they had. Opal had walked this route 100 times. She knew it was 240 steps from their cabin door to the cave entrance. She had counted it in summer and autumn, in moderate winter, in every condition except this one, where each step forward was a negotiation with wind that wanted them on the ground. At step 180, Opal began to doubt. The angle felt wrong. The ground beneath her feet felt unfamiliar. She started calculating the possibility that they had veered off course, that they were walking parallel to the formations instead of toward them, that in 30 more steps they would pass the cliff face in Hurley and walk into open prairie where the wind would finish what the cold had started. At step 220, she was certain they were lost. At step 237, they walked into solid stone. The cave was 47 degrees. Opal knew this without a thermometer because her body had become the instrument calibrated by 4 months of sleeping against sandstone and waking to the same steady warmth regardless of what the sky was doing. 47 degrees felt like a specific thing, now a physical sensation as recognizable as the weight of her own boots or the sound of Hjalmar breathing in the dark. They stood in the front chamber shaking, not from cold alone, but from the chemical aftermath of walking 240 steps through wind that had tried to peel them off the face of the earth. The silence inside the cave was absolute, not quiet, silence. The kind that pressed against your ears and made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own blood moving, the small mechanical sounds of a body that was still functioning. Then they laughed, both of them, at the same time, not joyful laughter. The slightly unhinged sound of two people who had just gambled their lives on a geological formation and won. Hjalmar leaned against the cave wall and slid down to the floor, still laughing, holding his ribs. Opal stood with her hands on her knees, gasping, laughing, feeling the tears freeze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. 237, she said. What? 237 steps. I counted 240 last summer. We drifted 3 steps east. Hjalmar stared at her, then laughed harder. They were not alone for long. The same storm that had driven them from their cabin was driving others toward the only shelter in the basin that could not be broken by wind. By dawn on January 23rd, 13 people had crowded into the cave. The Johnson family arrived first. Husband, wife, 3 children. The youngest was 4, carried in her father's arms with a blanket wrapped around her head so only her eyes showed wide and terrified, and not understanding why the world had turned into noise and cold. The Johnsons' cabin had lost sections of roof in the initial gusts, and when the temperature inside dropped below what the children could survive, they had wrapped every blanket they owned around the smallest bodies and walked west toward the formations, navigating by memory, the way Opal and Yalmar had navigated by count. The Chen family came next, 2 people quiet efficient, carrying more supplies per person than anyone else, because they had survived the railroad labor camps and understood that preparation was not optimism, but mathematics. They had packed food, water, a medical kit, and extra clothing in the time it took the wind to rip the east wall of their cabin inward. Old Oscar Kestrel appeared at the entrance an hour before dawn, 63 years old, walking alone, carrying nothing but a flask of schnapps and the stubborn German conviction that a man did not need help from anyone. He had refused to leave his cabin until the chimney collapsed and filled the interior with smoke and ash. Even then, he had stopped to close the door behind him, as though manners applied to buildings the same way they applied to people. Declan Marlowe, a freight hauler from Missouri, had been caught between settlements with a loaded wagon. He abandoned the wagon when the wind tore the canvas cover away and unhitched his mules and walked them west because someone in Utica had told him about a cave and he had nothing else to walk toward. Adrian Hathaway arrived last, his railroad survey camp destroyed, when the main tent ripped free of its stakes and vanished into the darkness like a kite cut from its string. He walked in carrying in his leather notebook and a surveyor's transit because a Dutch engineer saved his instruments the way other men saved their guns. 13 people. In a cave Opal had chosen because it was deep enough to hold heat and high enough to prevent smoke from pooling at head level. 13 people who should have been scattered across 12 miles of frozen prairie, each in their own failing structure, each fighting the same losing battle against air that had dropped below 30 degrees and wind that had no intention of stopping. Opal did not wait for consensus. She organized. Rear chamber for women and children, front chamber for men, fire pit burning on a schedule she established in the first hour, food pooled and inventoried. Every person told what was expected of them and what was available to them. She moved through the cave with the authority of someone who understood every corner of the space because she had built it, lived in it, and defended it, and no one questioned her, because the only qualification that mattered in a crisis was competence, and Opal had been proving hers since November. Yalmar managed the firewood. Declan Marlowe contributed 3 bottles of whiskey from his freight load and was surprised when Opal told him to keep them sealed. "Not until we are outside," she said. "My rules." Declan, who was 28 and had spent his adult life answering to no one, opened his mouth to argue. Then he looked at the 4-year-old Johnson girl sleeping on the platform and at Opal standing between him and the whiskey with an expression that did not invite negotiation, and he put the bottles back in his bag. The first 2 days were manageable, cramped, loud with children and tension and the sounds of 13 people sharing a space designed for 2. But manageable. The cave held its temperature. The fire pit worked. The hearthstones released their warmth in slow, patient waves that kept the front chamber above 40 degrees, while outside the wind sustained above 50 miles per hour and the temperature wandered between 31 below and 49 below. On the 3rd day, old Oscar Kestrel started a fight. Not a physical fight. Oscar was 63 and not foolish enough to swing at a woman in a cave full of witnesses. But he had spent 3 days watching Opal ration firewood with a discipline he considered excessive. And on the morning of the 3rd day, when the 4-year-old Johnson girl woke up crying from cold and the front chamber had dipped to 39 degrees, Oscar decided he had been quiet long enough. "Burn more," he said. Not a request, a statement delivered with the weight of a man who had been building structures in Montana since before Opal knew Montana existed. "We have wood, the children are cold. Stop rationing like we are under siege." Opal met his eyes. "We do not know when this ends. If the storm lasts another 3 days and we have burned through our supply in 2, what do you suggest we burn then?" The sleeping platforms, the door frame, I have survived more winters than you have lived years. Oscar said, his accent thickening the way it did when emotion pushed him back toward his native tongue. Do not lecture me about cold. The cave went quiet, 13 people holding their breath. The Johnson mother looked at Opal, then at Oscar, then at her daughter still crying, and her expression carried the unbearable weight of a parent watching strangers argue over whether her child would be warm enough to survive. Opal made a calculation, not mathematical this time, emotional. The kind of calculation that Babsy had never taught because it could not be taught, only learned through the particular education of being responsible for people who are afraid. One additional burn during the day, Opal said. Hearthstones stay loaded through the night on the existing schedule. If the storm breaks in 3 days, we come out with fuel to spare. If it goes longer, we will adjust. Oscar muttered something in German that did not sound complimentary. But the additional daytime burn raised the front chamber by 4 degrees, and the Johnson girls stopped crying, and Oscar did not argue again. Not because he agreed with Opal, but because the child was warm, and that was the only outcome that mattered to a man who had built things his entire life and understood, perhaps better than he would admit, that building consensus was harder than building walls. On the 4th day, the food situation became real. 13 people consuming provisions that had been stored for 2. Opal had inventoried everything on the first night and kept the numbers to herself because panic in a sealed space was more dangerous than hunger. But Adrian Hathaway was an engineer, and engineers notice things. He sat beside Opal in the front chamber while the others slept, speaking quietly. How long do we have? 2 days. Maybe 3 if we cut portions again. And if the storm continues past that. Opal did not answer. Adrian studied her face in the dim light of the cooling hearthstones. I notice you have not eaten your portion since yesterday. Opal said nothing. You are giving your food to the Johnson children. I am distributing rations according to need. You are starving yourself to keep 3 children fed. I am doing what needs to be done. Adrian leaned back against the stone wall. You cannot save everyone by destroying yourself, as Holmberg. If you collapse, who manages the fire schedule? Who rations the water? Who keeps Oscar Kestrel and Declan Marlowe from making decisions that will get people killed? Opal looked at him. In the half-dark, her face showed the first cracks in the competence she had been projecting since the storm began. Not weakness, exhaustion. The specific fatigue of a person who has been responsible for others so long that the responsibility has become indistinguishable from identity, and the idea of setting it down even for one night feels like a form of abandonment. I am distributing rations according to need, she repeated, but her voice had lost its certainty. That night, after the others were asleep and the cave had settled into the deep silence that only stone could create, Opal sat alone by the hearthstones. Hjalmar was in the rear chamber, his feet still aching from the frostbite of the previous year, worse now in the extreme cold. He had told her something earlier that evening, holding her hand in the darkness, his voice steady and matter of fact. If I do not make it through this, the homestead claim goes to you. I have already written it. Opal had squeezed his hand. You will not die in this cave. I will not allow it. You say that as if you control death. I control this cave, and inside this cave, I do not allow it. Hjalmar had smiled in the dark, fallen asleep, and Opal had gone to the front chamber and sat by the dying hearthstones and done something she had not done since she was 19 years old, standing in a limestone cave in the Carpathian foothills. She prayed, not the way Father Roland would have approved, not with folded hands and downcast eyes in the structured language of the church. She spoke to the stone, to the earth, to the weight of the mountain above her, in Polish because some things could only be said in the language you first learned them in. I did everything you taught me. I listened. I built. I remembered. Do not let them die here. No answer came. No voice from the rock. No sign. But Opal slept afterward for the first time in 4 days, and when she woke, her hands were steady and her mind was clear, and she could not explain why, except that sometimes the act of asking for help, even from stone, was enough to make a person strong enough to not need it. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. Old Oscar Kestrel, the man who had challenged Opal over firewood rations, woke before dawn. He looked at the three Johnson children huddled together on the sleeping platform, the youngest tucked between her siblings, all of them curled tight against the cold. He did not say anything. He stood up, walked to the warmest spot in the cave directly beside the hearthstones where residual heat was strongest and gave it up. Moved to the coldest corner of the front chamber, sat down, pulled his coat tight, and closed his eyes. The Johnson mother saw this. Opal saw this. Neither said a word. Oscar did not want thanks, did not need acknowledgement. He had fought Opal over rations and lost, and now he was making his own contribution in the only currency that mattered inside a cave in January. Warmth, given from the body that had the most of it to the bodies that had the least. Opal caught his eye across the chamber. She nodded. He nodded back. Two people who did not particularly like each other, recognizing that respect and affection were not the same thing and that in a crisis respect was enough. On the sixth day, the wind stopped. Not gradually, not in stages. It stopped the way a machine stops when someone cuts the power. One moment, the world outside was a continuous roar of moving air. The next moment, silence. The particular silence of a landscape that has been scoured so thoroughly that nothing remains to make sound. Temperature climbed to 10 below zero. After 6 days below 30, 10 below felt like spring. 13 people walked out of the cave into a world they did not recognize. Snow had been sculpted into frozen waves 10 feet high in some places, while other areas were stripped bare to frozen earth where the wind had scoured everything away. The sky was colorless. The sun sat on the horizon like a pale coin, behind gauze providing light, but no warmth illuminating a landscape that looked like the surface of a planet where nothing had ever lived. Opal and Yalmar found their cabin still standing. The walls held, but every window was blown out, and the door hung from one hinge twisted by wind pressure that had worked it back and forth for 6 days until the wood split along the grain. Repairable, but not livable. Not today. The Johnson cabin had lost its entire roof. Gone. Not collapsed. Gone. The wind had lifted it intact and deposited it somewhere in the basin where spring would eventually reveal it wedged against a cottonwood trunk a quarter mile from where it belonged. The Chen family's cabin had collapsed completely. East wall blown inward by wind pressure, bringing the roof and the north wall down with it. Everything they owned was buried under timber and snow. Of the 13 people who had sheltered in the cave, only 3 had homes they could return to immediately. The other 10 stayed in the cave for another week while they rebuilt. Across Montana territory, the final count came in slowly through February and March, as riders reached isolated homesteads and found what they found. 214 people dead. Entire families frozen in their cabins when fuel ran out and no one came. Riders frozen in their saddles, still mounted, horses dead beneath them. Both pointed toward destinations they never reached. Cattle died by the thousands, frozen where they stood in clusters, pressed together for warmth that was not enough. In Opal's cave, the total number of deaths was 0. 3 days after the storm broke, Big Ansel Aldridge walked in carrying enough supplies for 20 people. He had organized Utica during the 6 days of the storm, moving between houses, redistributing firewood from those who had surplus to those who were running out, checking on isolated families, pulling 2 lost travelers into Verity Fenimore's store, which had become a secondary shelter. Ansel had done this without being asked, without authority, without plan. He had simply seen what needed doing and done it the way he had seen Opal manage her cave, and learned without either of them acknowledging it that the first rule of survival was not strength or preparation, but paying attention. 13 people, Ansel said, standing in the cave entrance, looking at the sleeping platforms, the fire pit, the provisions that had lasted just barely long enough. 214 dead across the territory, and this cave held 13. He did not add commentary. The numbers did not require it. March of 1875 should have been recovery, should have been rebuilding and replanting in the slow return of normalcy. Instead, it brought Boone Fenimore. Fenimore arrived in the basin on a chestnut gelding with saddlebags full of legal documents and the polished confidence of a man who made his living acquiring things that other people valued. He was 44. Helena based a land speculator who had made modest fortunes buying distressed homestead claims from settlers who had been broken by weather or debt, or the simple realization that the frontier did not care how hard you were willing to work. He had purchased the Hollister claim from Barrett Braddock, Opal's original homestead, the land she had worked for 18 months after Sheridan's death, the land Barrett had stolen through a planted coin and a silent sister. Fenimore had bought it for a fraction of its value because Barrett, it turned out, was better at scheming than farming, and two bad harvests had left him eager to sell. But Fenimore had not come to the basin for a single homestead. He had come for the sandstone formations. He had filed a mineral survey claim covering the entire cliff face, a legal maneuver that would give him priority access to any resources in the rock, including the cave that Opal had turned into the most reliable shelter in the territory. He rode to the cave on a cold March morning and delivered his terms with the professional courtesy of a man who had done this many times before. I understand your attachment to this place, Mrs. Holmberg, but I have filed a mineral survey claim covering these formations. Federal mining law gives me priority rights. You have 30 days to vacate. Opal took the papers, read them, understood them. Understood also that this was not Cartwright the bureaucrat who could be outmaneuvered with community petitions and legal precedents. Fenimore had actual legal standing, actual paperwork, actual power. And behind Fenimore, invisible but present, was Barrett Braddock, still reaching for her from 67 miles away, still trying to take the last thing she had. Opal stood at the cave entrance holding Fenimore's documents, and for the first time since Honora told her to leave, she felt the exact same sensation. The ground shifting, the certainty dissolving. The realization that what she had built could be taken by someone with the right piece of paper. But this time there was a difference. This time, when she looked up from the papers, she was not alone. Ansel Aldridge arrived within the hour. He had heard about Fenimore from the Utica postmaster, who had heard from the land office clerk in Fort Benton. Ansel rode hard and arrived breathing heavily, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on never appearing rushed. He did not address Opal, he addressed Fenimore. Mr. Fenimore, this cave sheltered 13 people last month during the worst storm in Montana history. It has saved more lives than that over the past 2 winters. 47 residents of this basin signed a petition recognizing it as a community shelter on public land. I have been in Montana since '68. I know every official, every judge, every newspaper editor from here to Helena. You want to shut down a public shelter so you can file a mineral claim on sandstone? Go ahead. But when the story reaches the newspapers, and it will reach the newspapers, people will remember who saved 13 lives, and they will remember who tried to close the place that did it. Adrian Hathaway stepped forward with his technical report. 12 pages documenting temperature data, structural analysis usage records, and a formal engineering assessment that the cave constituted a significant improvement to public land with measurable community benefit. Father Rowland, arriving last because his mare was old and slow, presented a letter from the territorial bishop endorsing the preservation of the cave as a community resource. Father Rowland had written to the bishop in February after the storm, after the 13, after he had stood in the cave, and finally understood that what Opal had built was not desperation, but something closer to grace. The Johnsons stood behind Opal. The Chins stood behind Opal. Old Oscar Kestrel stood behind Opal, arms folded, jaw set, looking at Fenimore with the particular contempt of a craftsman for a man who built nothing. Declan Marlowe stood behind Opal because he had slept in her cave for 6 days and eaten her food and benefited from her discipline, and a man paid his debts. Fenimore looked at the petition, looked at Adrian's report, looked at Rowland's letter, looked at the faces of the people standing behind a Polish woman at the entrance to a sandstone cave. He was not a stupid man. He could calculate odds as quickly as Opal could calculate calories. The mineral claim was legally sound, but legal soundness meant nothing if public opinion turned it into a story about a land speculator evicting a community hero. Helena newspapers love stories like that. Territorial politicians love positioning themselves against stories like that. Fenimore would win the claim and lose everything else. He folded his papers, slid them into his saddlebag. "I will reconsider the scope of my survey," he said, mounted his horse, rode south without looking back. Opal watched him go. Yamar put his arm around her shoulders, and she led him, which was not something she did easily or often. But in that moment, she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, recognition. The slow, settling understanding that for the first time in her life, she had not fought alone. That the people standing behind her were not there because of charity or obligation or pity, but because the cave had kept them alive and defending it was defending themselves. Her survival had become their survival. And that connection built from stone and fire and shared cold was something that no document could dissolve. The community formalized the cave that spring. Permanent sleeping platforms. A proper door with iron hinges donated by the Fort Benton blacksmith. A secondary chamber excavated deeper into the sandstone with picks and patience. Adrian Hathaway drew formal plans and submitted them to the territorial government with a proposal for similar shelters along major routes. The proposal went nowhere. Governments moved slowly and frontier settlers moved fast. But the plan circulated. Within a year, 7 cave shelters existed across Montana territory, each built by people who had heard the story and recognized sense when they saw it. Years passed, the way years do on the frontier. Slowly when you are living them, quickly when you look back. Opal and Yalmar raised 4 children on the homestead. 2 boys, 2 girls. The oldest a boy they named Piotr, after Opal's father was born in the cabin during a thunderstorm in July of 1875. 5 months after 13 people walked out of a cave and into a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Opal delivered him with the help of the Johnson wife who had walked 4 miles in summer heat because she said she owed a debt and debts were paid in person. The cabin rebuilt after the storm of 75 with lessons learned from every failure stood for 30 years without significant repair. Hjalmar farmed. Opal managed everything else, which on a Montana homestead meant she managed most of what mattered. She kept the books made, the repairs negotiated with suppliers in Utica, and settled disputes with neighboring claims using the same calm directness she had used on Hjalmar the morning he moved her food stores. People in the basin learned not to argue with her. Not because she was harsh, but because she was usually right, and being right quietly was more persuasive than being loud about anything. She taught all 4 children to read and write in English and Polish, taught them carpentry and fire management and the names of rocks and the signs that predicted weather. Taught them without calling it by name the principle Babcia had planted in her years ago. That the land was not an enemy to be conquered, but a teacher to be studied. That every problem had already been solved by geology or physics or biology, and the only skill worth having was the patience to notice. Opal became known in the basin as the person who solved problems by watching how nature solved them, first a reputation that brought her visitors from as far as Helena engineers and homesteaders, and occasionally a university professor who wanted to document her methods for academic journals she would never read. In 1889, a letter arrived from Fort Benton in handwriting Opal had not seen in 16 years. Honora's handwriting, cramped, uncertain, the penmanship of a woman who did not write often. Barrett was dead. Winter of '85. Frozen on the trail between Fort Benton and the homestead the same way Sheridan had frozen on a trap line 13 years earlier. The particular irony of a man who had schemed to take Opal's land dying the same way Opal's first husband had died was not lost on her, but she did not dwell on it. Irony was not justice, it was just pattern. Honora had sold the land, was living in Fort Benton dependent on church charity. The letter did not contain an apology, not in words, but folded inside the paper were 3 silver dollars. Opal sat at her kitchen table and held the coins in her palm for a long time. $3, the exact amount Barrett had accused her of stealing, the exact amount that had cost her everything and given her everything in the same gesture. She did not know if Honora was returning stolen money or confessing complicity or simply trying to close a circle that had been open for 16 years. She did not know, and it did not matter. Some debts could not be repaid because the person who was owed had already built a life so far beyond the original loss that the currency no longer meant what it once meant. She put the coins in a tin box, did not write back, did not visit, did not forgive publicly or refuse to forgive or make any declaration at all. She simply closed the box and placed it on a shelf and let 16 years of silence remain unbroken. Not from anger, from completion. The story between her and Honora had ended on November 14th, 1873, and no amount of silver could rewrite its conclusion. In 1891, Big Ansel Aldridge died. He was 69. A hard winter had settled into his lungs, and by February, it was clear that the cough was not going to stop. Opal visited him in his cabin, the same cabin he had built in '68, the same cabin where he had sat on the porch repairing harnesses when he told her she would die in a hole in the ground. Ansel was propped up in bed, thinner than she had ever seen him, his massive hands resting on the quilt like tools that had been set down for the last time. He did not want comfort, did not want prayers. He wanted to talk to Opal, and he wanted the room cleared of everyone else, which his wife and daughters accepted, because Ansel Aldridge, giving orders from his deathbed, was not substantially different from Ansel Aldridge, giving orders from anywhere else. "I was wrong about you," he said. His voice was rough, scraped thin by coughing, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, direct, unwilling to soften anything even now. "But it was the best wrong I have ever been, because it taught me something I should have learned 30 years earlier. Listening to the land matters more than listening to yourself." Opal held his hand, did not speak. Some moments did not require words, and this was one of them. Ansel closed his eyes and slept. He did not wake again. Opal carried that conversation for the rest of her life, not as grief exactly, but as confirmation. Ansel Aldridge had been the first person in the basin to publicly admit he was wrong about her, and the last thing he said on this earth was a restatement of the principle she had built her entire life around. Pay attention to what is already working. Stop fighting what you cannot change. Use what the land gives you. The last recorded visit Opal Sheridan Holmberg made to the cave was in April of 1903. She was 71 years old, walking slowly but without assistance, covering the 3 miles from the homestead to the sandstone formations in slightly over 2 hours. She brought 2 of her grandchildren, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, and she showed them everything. The fire pit, still intact. The hearthstones she had laid 30 years ago, still showing dark marks where countless fires had heated them through countless nights. The walls she had built from cottonwood poles and creek clay, mostly rotted now, but the post holes still visible in the cave floor. The rear chamber where she had slept that first night, with nothing but 2 dresses in the memory of a grandmother who understood stone. The children explored the way children do, touching everything, asking questions, running their hands over the sandstone walls the way Opal had run her hand over this same rock 30 years earlier, and felt the steadiness that changed her life. The girl asked the question. 7 years old, standing at the cave entrance with the April sun behind her, looking into the darkness of the rear chamber. "Were you scared, grandmother, all alone in here?" Opal sat down at the cave entrance, leaned her back against the sandstone, the same spot where she had leaned on that first night, 29 years old, holding everything she owned in a flour sack, listening to coyotes and trying not to think about how hungry she was. "I was scared," she said, "but I was more scared of standing in the cold than of walking into the dark. Sometimes you do not choose between safe and dangerous. You choose between one fear and another. I chose the fear that had a roof." The girl considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to questions they do not yet know are important. Then she walked into the cave and sat down on the old sleeping platform and declared that she would like to live here. Opal laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had not made in that first winter when laughter was a luxury she could not afford. She watched her granddaughter explore the space that had saved her life, saved Yalmar's life, saved 13 lives in a single storm, and she thought about Babcia standing on the Hamburg dock nearly 40 years ago, nodding once, not waving, sending Opal into the world with nothing but knowledge and the faith that knowledge would be enough. It had been enough. Not because the knowledge was extraordinary, but because Opal had been willing to use it when everyone around her said it would fail. Willing to trust stone over convention. Willing to learn from a grandmother's hands instead of a husband's dreams. Willing to stand at the entrance of a cave in November and decide that what looked like the end of everything was actually the beginning of something that would outlast her. Outlast her children, outlast the frontier itself. The cave remained functional into the 1920s. The formations were eventually incorporated into a state land preserve, and in 1967, archaeologists documented the cave entrance and found Opal's original fire pit still intact, harsh stones still bearing the thermal scars of fires that had burned through the worst winters Montana had ever delivered. Carbon dating of charcoal deposits confirmed continuous use from 1873 through approximately 1918. 45 years of holding steady when the world outside went wild. There is a historical marker there now, 3 miles west of what used to be the Hollister claim on a dirt road that most travelers pass without stopping. 200 words on a bronze plaque explaining what one woman demonstrated in a single winter and spent the rest of her life proving. That survival on the frontier was not about overpowering nature, but about understanding it well enough to borrow its principles. That observation outperformed assumption every time. That sometimes the best shelter was the one that had been there for 10 million years, waiting for someone practical enough to recognize it. Opal Sheridanter's story is not about conquering nature. It is about paying attention to what nature was already doing and being smart enough to step aside and let it work. Sometimes the best tool is observation. Sometimes the strongest shelter is the one that requires the least fighting. And sometimes wisdom looks like a 29-year-old Polish woman standing at a cave entrance in 1873, watching smoke rise from her sister's chimney 3 miles east, and deciding that being cast out might be the best thing that ever happened to her.